Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And I'm Jenny Wojciechowski.
And today we are joined by Professor Stephen Cook, who is the Kathryn N. McBurney Professor of Old Testament Language and Literature at Virginia Theological Seminary. Stephen is a scholar of biblical theology, apocalypticism, and prophetic literature. He received his MDiv and PhD from Yale University and previously taught at Union Theological Seminary. He's the author of numerous books and essays, including major studies on Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, and Daniel. And we are just so delighted that he accepted our invitation to talk to us today about the book of Ezekiel. So thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us.
Very delighted to be here. It's an honor. Thank you.
All right, well, let's get started with how would you sum up Ezekiel in just a few sentences?
Ezekiel is, my gosh, he's so fascinating because he has these incredible visionary experiences that brings him far beyond the workaday, banal world and right into God's presence. And then what he discovers is that God's presence is so holy, and by that, it's something so physically awesome that it just bowls him over. So it's weird. We don't see much about Ezekiel himself because everything is just filled with God and God's presence and God's holiness. But that holiness is so powerful and dangerous that Israel's in big trouble. And he's in the midst of a huge catastrophe because the lack of holiness and indeed the mucky, terribly chaotic state that God's people are in has endangered the presence of God's holiness. The presence of God amongst God's people becomes a huge issue in the book. So that's kind of where it starts. Ezekiel's in exile out in Babylonia and wondering what on earth he's going to do with his life. He was supposed to be a temple priest, but here he is in exile at the age around 30 for taking up his duties in the temple, and yet looks like the Babylonians within a decade are going to completely destroy Jerusalem and the temple. So everything is crumbling under his feet. It kind of feels like today when everything we thought was stable and normal is just the unthinkable is happening all around the world.
Oh,
yeah. A traumatic time for Ezekiel. So what's a way into the book? Like, do you just start at the beginning and go to the end, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can start at the beginning because the first few chapters bring you right into God's presence. And it's kind of fun to start there because the rabbis said you had to be at least 40 years old to even dare read this vision of what God is like, because it's so dangerous to have Ezekiel describing God in a visual way. It's like it's completely unheard of. But God is present, but not where you would think God should be present. Not in the temple, not in the Holy Land, but in this unclean, terribly unholy, desecrated exile. So God is there, and yet God is holy amidst the unholiness and the depravity. So you're immediately thrown into all sorts of contradictions and mind-spinning conundrums. So that I think those are the way to get into the book, is to think about God's presence, absence, and God's holiness, and how that holiness is so tremendous that is literally not like anything. It's completely other than anything we normally experience in our day-to-day, banal, quotidian world.
And that holiness, that vision of God, I like what you said. It shows up in this very unholy place, not in the temple, not in Jerusalem, but in Babylon, of all places, which would seem to be God-forsaken, perhaps, to Ezekiel.
Yeah, well, now we have to be a little careful because Ezekiel's not, ethnocentric and saying only the land of Israel and only people of this ethnicity. But he has this very complex and hierarchical understanding of how this phenomenon of holiness works. And it's all centered in the presence of God. And it's not trying to isolate God or hold God in to just this one ethnicity. Far from it. It's not xenophobic at all, although Ezekiel often gets that bad reputation. But it's the sort of holiness that's so powerful and yet dangerous at the same time that you have to kind of put out little protective shields and little firewalls and borders and strata just to keep everybody safe. Hopefully, eventually, the holiness will cover the earth as water covers the sea, but that time is not yet. As any look around at the international scene will tell you, Ezekiel is very aware of the huge problematic nature that humanity has gotten themselves into.
Well, kind of given this, this lead up, like this is this wild book, is there an age limit, on approaching? So who was the original audience? And when was it written? For whom was it written?
Well, those, of course, are complicated questions. And the book comes at a very interesting time in Israel's history. Up until this time, or shortly before, prophets were usually right out there, going into the public square or into the city gate and just confronting people live. But in exile, people were, they weren't exactly under house arrest, but their mobility was limited. Their audience might have been quite spread out. And they were getting more interested in their written scriptural authoritative traditions. So all of that is starting to come together in Ezekiel. One of the first things he does is God gives him the prophecies he's going to speak as a scroll, and he eats them, literally eats the scroll, eats his prophecy. That has a lot of ramifications, spiritual and theological. But one thing it means is that it's not so much anymore just an inspired prophet interacting immediately with an audience, but it's a group headed by a prophet that are very carefully and artistically creating very complex, even Byzantine messages that are elaborate and deep, and they're drawing on other scriptures, quoting other texts, creating incredibly rich stuff. And of course, this is the beginning of what Christians and Jews now engage in when they do theology. We're not listening directly to inspired prophets, but we're reading texts and digging into them and hearing God's word and God's message coming out of the text and shaping our lives.
Well, thank you, Stephen. We've come to one of our favorite portions of each episode, Bible Bingo, and we asked you ahead of time to name 5 concepts, words, people, places, themes that would be on your bingo card as you read the book of Ezekiel. So we'll go through these and have you elaborate just briefly on each one. So the first one you listed is glory of the Lord.
So that's in Hebrew, it's the word kavod, and it can mean different things in different contexts. Different schools of thought within the Bible, different biblical theologies mean different things by it. But in Ezekiel, it's very embodied. It really is presence with a capital P. The glory of the Lord is something that travels around and only appears in time, space, here or there. It's localized and it's very impactful and it's very holy. So when Ezekiel starts to see it, he starts at right in the first few chapters, he begins describing these cherubim figures, which are composite, mishvesin kind of monsters. And then he moves into a wheel structure, and then the kind of cosmic firmament above the wheels. Verse upon verse, chapter upon chapter, he's just describing the undercarriage of God's throne. And it's only at the very end that he begins to talk about the kavod, the presence of God itself. And there, he's very scared to even tell you what he's seeing. It's like, I saw this figure, and it was kind of like what seemed to be a similitude of God. Like removed.
Several steps removed.
Several steps removed from the reality itself. It's as if he was terrified that if he really told you what he was seeing, you would perhaps not survive the night. It's that awesome.
Wow. Well, your second term is related to that. The term is wheels within wheels.
Yeah, so that may be one of the things that, anyone on the street may know if they know anything about the African American spirituals. Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of that, and the dry bone passage are the two that many people know. But when you think about it, wheels within wheels, that's not the normal way that vehicles and chariots move around. We're used to
Right.
wheels on one axis and movement that's kind of unidirectional. So already, I think as soon as we see these wheels and how complicated they are and how they're spinning within each other, we begin to realize that this book is inviting us into visions of reality that are much more complex and multidimensional than your average experience. So scholars have a very complicated word for this. It's a non-mimetic description of reality, which simply means that don't expect to read Ezekiel and be able to comprehend it using what your five senses normally tell you. You're going to be seeing new dimensions beyond the normal four that we deal with. You're going to be seeing some of these dimensions bended or twisted. You're going to see God moving about in ways that are going to blow your mind. But certainly wheels mean God moves. God's, in late terms, God has four-wheel drive. God can go anywhere in the universe. And just because the temple is going to lie in ruins within 10 years of this initial vision doesn't mean that God is gone. God is occupying. The temple may be what Christians might call an iconographic representation or a thin space or a holy wormhole, but it's not the reality itself. And so that's, I think, one of the things you're seeing with these wheels. I mean, I could go on and on. They're full of eyes. So what does that mean? They're full of, the eyes of God is God's interconnecting presence between heaven and earth. So these two realms that are so different, the celestial and the terrestrial, Ezekiel's finding them starting to interact or interconnect. And that's going to be huge later in the book when you get to that famous apocalyptic text about Gog of Magog. You're going to see what we think of as symbolic and transcendent suddenly becoming tangible, realistic, invading reality. Ezekiel is weird. It's not your everyday kind of prophetic book.
Yeah. Kind of psychedelic visions there.
Yeah, not a few people have accused him of eating mushrooms and other strange substance. There's a rich literature of psychoanalysis of Ezekiel. No kidding.
So you already mentioned this passage, but your third term on your bingo card is probably one of the maybe the most well-known passage in Ezekiel. It's about the Valley of Dry Bones.
Yeah. Yes. That's an amazing passage, and of course, the hip bone's connected to the, leg bone and so on. It's an old song, but it's an amazing passage. It's this vision of life returning to a world that has experienced the depths of the abyss. And, how many of us today feel like we have just lost a sense of life's orientation, the energy to get up every morning. So many of my I think seminary students feel the chaos and pain in the world maybe more than your average person. And sometimes they just get debilitated just turning on the radio and looking at all of the problems. And so to have this recreation, because that's really what it is, the breathing of God's breath back into what is cut off from life, what is down in the depths of darkness, the shadow of death. And yet it's even more than that, because the Hebrew term ruach, which means wind, it starts out from the four winds of the cosmos. The bones feel the wind, and then it's breath, which is another meaning of ruach, animates them biologically. But by the end of the passage in 37, it's actually God's own ruach, which means it's not simply about a nation in exile being repatriated and brought back to life as an ethnicity. It's really about a new ennoblement of humanity to be more developed and more sanctified into the sorts of beings that you won't have the glory of God, the kavod, having to depart from the temple again. So this is not just fixing what's broken, but it's ensuring that what went wrong can never happen again. And that's, the way that Ezekiel manages that is mind-blowing.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful description of that story in chapter 37. So you're the fourth bingo term, new heart and new spirit.
Right. So that's related. That actually comes fairly soon after the vision of the dry bones. And it really is an image of new creation. It's an admission that humanity, despite knowing how to thrive and how to live and how to be happy consistently and irrationally chooses to be miserable and just cannot figure out how to live in a way that would bring everybody true community and mutual support and mutuality. So Ezekiel comes to the conclusion that new creation is needed. It's in some ways the same message as the Valley of Dry Bones, that God has to move in radically and recreate the human being in such a way that we're no longer so miserable. Our world is no longer so broken.
A word of hope.
Yes. Usually Ezekiel gets this reputation as being just a gloomy, judgmental, awful book, and it really is a book of hope, ultimately.
Yeah. And your last term has to do with that hope. So temple and living water.
Yes. So a lot of times the temple gets very short shrift. Commentators writing on the book leave it to the very end. Moshe Greenberg, the famous Jewish commentator on Ezekiel, he got to the Valley of Dry Bones vision, and then his body just gave out. He could never bring himself. He got to the best part. Who wants to describe all of this architecture of this utopian temple, all of the details? But when you study it closely, it's actually full of theology and spirituality. And part of that is this stream of living water that flows out. This is another way that Ezekiel overcomes this bad reputation about being insular and protective and ethnocentric or xenophobic. No, life and holiness are flowing out into the world from this central holy sacramental spot, this utopian temple, and changing the whole world. And people got excited about it. The Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scroll community, built their community in the northwest corner of the Dead Sea precisely because that's where Ezekiel's stream of living water in chapter 47 is up flowing. So they wanted, when the new world comes, they wanted to be right there. And so they picked the most godforsaken, dry, waterless place on earth to wait for God's utopian reality to come.
I didn't know that about the Dead Sea Scrolls community. That's interesting. Yeah, it's such a beautiful image that the living water goes into the Dead Sea and makes it live, right? So that there are fish in the Dead Sea. It's
and of course,
beautiful.
Jesus picks up on this. I mean, in some ways, at least for Christians, you got to hear those echoes of the Old Testament to really get to know Jesus' identity. Jesus' identity is not accessible to us apart from study of the Hebrew Bible and partaking of the bread of the Eucharist. I mean, that's the message of the Emmaus episode. You know Jesus by reading the Old Testament and eating the bread, and then you know him. But one of the things Jesus is a temple in the Gospel of John. He is that Jacob's ramp where the angels come up and down. And then shortly thereafter, he's in the temple saying, if you want to look for Ezekiel's living waters, it's flowing out from me. Yeah. And it's going to flow into you, and from you, it's going to flow into others. So again, it's systemic. It's a network. It's not just about one individual, each individual having a personal experience of redemption, but it's really redeeming the whole community of God's people and the whole world. I mean, water is a very grounded, natural, environmental thing. And it's so the land is just as important in Ezekiel as anything else.
Oh, that's beautiful. So just to review, the 5 bingo terms are glory of the Lord, wheels within wheels, valley of dry bones, new heart and new spirit, and temple and living water. So thank you for playing Bible bingo, Stephen.
Sorry to elaborate everything in such detail. It's just Ezekiel's easy to get excited about. It's rich.
Yeah.
All right. So normally I would say Now, what's weird or interesting about this book? But there are only so many hours in the day, so I'm going to edit this slightly and say, what's especially weird or interesting about the book of Ezekiel?
Oh, gosh, there's so much. Goodness gracious. Divine holiness, trauma, restoration, cosmic order. I would say this understanding of the nature of holiness is just not what people normally think. And the nature of God's presence is not what we normally, at least in our American religion, we kind of go to God when there's a problem, when we need therapeutic comfort, or we think of God as sort of a dualistic being that's separate from day-to-day life. But Ezekiel has these visions that call all of that into question. And when he does experience the presence of God, holiness as almost a fluid physical thing that is both positive but also negative. That's just weird. It's not what we're used to, but it's so rich in terms of understanding why, in liturgical worship, like Jenny and I, and Lutherans too, there's this sense that something very real, maybe not physical in the sense that science could discover it, but in terms of a larger expanse and dimensionality to reality, where you don't always see heaven's involvement. This sort of interconnection with holiness is something very real. And thank goodness we're now finally getting new quantum theories and new appreciations of the role of mind as irreducible, the role of spirit as not simply an epiphenomenon of biological activity. I think our society, at least in many places, is beginning to realize that everything can't be explained just in terms of the five senses, material reality, that there's things like holiness and consciousness and sentience that just don't reduce to things that you can study in a library. I'm glad that STEM programs in universities are healthy, but I wouldn't just throw out the humanities and the liberal arts like some places.
Amen to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
To do.
Well, I think you've already talked about the question that I'm going to ask to some extent. So the book, I'll just preface it by saying the book of Ezekiel is probably not amongst the top 3 for many Christians for various reasons that you've already talked about, the kind of strangeness of it. But why would you say is the book of Ezekiel important for Christian life and theology?
Oh my gosh. There's so many ways that the themes that it addresses are so crucial for both Testaments. And it's really reading both the New Testament as it treats these themes and the Hebrew Bible as it treats these themes that we get the full picture. I mean, this whole notion that Ezekiel has, that God is so much more multidimensional and mobile and present in ways that we can't begin to think, that reality is so much thicker and deeper than what we tend to settle for, and that we shouldn't just be satisfied with being great people and going through even churchly rituals. Those are all important. Morality is something Ezekiel's deeply concerned with. Temple structures and liturgies are something Ezekiel's deeply concerned with. But all of that is pointing beyond itself to really an ennoblement of the human being so that we can grow into this image of God, and that the world itself needs to be taken far more seriously because, and Ezekiel is continually reaching towards these eschatological and apocalyptic visions of a new Eden, the temple as a re-entry into Eden, but this time in a way that we can't muck it up. And our hearts will be wired in such a way that we would never go against God just to assert our own autonomy. We would never have political leadership. He has this famous, we didn't talk about this one, but the critique of the shepherds. That's one that actually does pop up in the Revised Common Lectionary. And it's so influential when Jesus talks about Jesus' self as the good shepherd, right? It's not just a critique of leadership. I mean, we could easily apply all Ezekiel's blasting of the bad shepherds to our leaders, but it's really, again, about the interconnectedness and the web of holiness, the matrix of responsibility, mutuality, sensitivity that connects all of us in this unseen, unempirical web or matrix of holiness that Ezekiel's. Because when the shepherds at the center are not keeping God at the center, the whole hierarchical matrix is collapsing. So it's really a critique of our society and not just leaders. So Ezekiel wants all of that put back into not a dull, constrained, fixed relationship. Remember, those wheels are full of eyes. All of these things that, these patterns and molds that Ezekiel sees, they're living, they're dynamic, they're sentient. It's very much both stable and dynamic at the same time. The wheels are very stable. They move in complete synchrony with the four-headed cherubim in the vision of God. But it's all this incredible synchronized movement that is huge dynamism and energy, but within a shalom of stability and order, so that everyone is given attention and valued and celebrated.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, this has been such a rich, interesting conversation about Ezekiel, and just sort of thinking about everything we've talked about. What's one key theme that you would want readers to look for as they enter into this text?
Let's see what I wrote down. I would say God's mobility, and I mean that in the sense of being able to come at us, not just like a satellite image, but just occupying rich dimensions beyond the 3 or 4 that we're used to, so that God can see us from behind and from underneath and from within in so many ways, that even when God seems to be absent, when seminaries are closing and the numbers of people who go to church on Sunday or go to synagogue on Saturday are rapidly diminishing, that doesn't mean that God isn't present. How could it even mean that? You just have to have a bigger God, a bigger sense of what God is and what God's reality is beyond just the scientific.
It's really nice. I like that.
Yeah. All right. Our last question, as always in these episodes, we asked you beforehand to describe the book of Ezekiel in 7 words or less.
All right.
Not an easy task.
I think it looks like you have 7 exactly.
I got 7 here. I have more than one possibility, but the one I landed on was holiness, stronger than exile, chaos, and death.
That's nice.
Say just a little more about that. It's beautiful, because, again, it's hopeful, right? And I loved your description of holiness as strong, but also dangerous, which is interesting. I think sometimes we Christians don't remember that, right?
Yeah, a lot of times we think of holiness as piety.
Right.
If a child is holy, then they're not making a lot of noise in the pew.
Yeah, right.
But that's not it at all. I think C.S. Lewis talked about the fact that we're kind of molded in such a way that we could produce the image of God eventually, but God has to pour the molten gold into us first, and that's going to hurt, Holiness is like this molten, dangerous, but wonderful substance, if you will, that can fill us, and it pains us, and there may even be pain in heaven if we're constantly exposed to the holiness of God. Hopefully we'll toughen up over time and be able to take more and more of it. But Ezekiel's just very aware that we have a long way to go. He wants people to imagine God in such a way that God is not just a jogging partner or a co-author or a good, really good
or
therapist.
Buddy or I love that. Holiness stronger than exile, chaos, and depth. It's a strong word of hope, and you've really brought that through from the book of Ezekiel. Stephen, thank you so much for helping guide us into this book.
It's just the text. That's why it's great to be a biblical scholar. The text does all the work.
Yeah, amen.
Oh, well, thank you. This has been a delight. I have learned a ton about Ezekiel, so thank you for that. And I'm sure our listeners have too. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate your following with us. You can get more great resources like this, conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, anything that you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.